Hi, let's get started on Unit 3 of the year. This is going to be on the biosphere. So, the biosphere is that part of the world that is encompassed by living organisms, primarily the surface of the earth and the shallow parts of the oceans. Now, it's really the main thing we want to know about in environmental science because being living organisms ourselves, we need to understand how these complex biosystems operate in order to understand what impacts we're having on it and how to reduce the negative impacts we're having. Because, quite frankly, we haven't been doing very well as a species in protecting the biosphere, and we're having some very profound negative impacts on it. And because we're learning about it and because we understand how it works, we're starting to find ways of reducing the damage we're doing and maybe even reversing some of it. So, let's get started. So, there's a lot to know about the biosphere, but we're going to start with cycles of matter. We've already talked about the water cycle, which is an important part of the biosphere as well. Today we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. So let's get started with it. So, carbon dioxide is a component of the atmosphere, and it is a highly mobile component of the atmosphere, like all other molecules are. So, at normal temperatures and pressures, carbon dioxide makes up a very minuscule part of our atmosphere, like way less than one, like 0.04% of the atoms in the atmosphere are carbon dioxide molecules. So, basically, about 400 parts per million or so. So, it's a very small amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. You'll hear me use CO2 and carbon dioxide interchangeably. Now, but it's a very important part of it because living tissues are constructed out of carbon atoms because they're able to make these very complex molecules. So even though it's a small amount of the overall uh, amount of air, the carbon component of it is really crucial for life on Earth. How does it get into the biosphere? Well, through the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle basically describes the manner in which carbon can move in and out of different parts of the atmosphere, biosphere, and geosphere, and hydrosphere. So here you go. We usually start off thinking of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what happens is it can do a number of things. So one thing it can do is it can diffuse into the ocean, just like when you make a carbonated beverage. Carbon dioxide can basically push by atmospheric pressure into the oceans. In fact, the largest reservoir of carbon on our planet is carbon dioxide that's dissolved into the ocean. But it can go into other places. Okay, so it can get caught up in living organisms. It can be moved into different types of rocks and fossil fuels, and it can be released back into the atmosphere. So this fairly complex cycle is what we want to focus in on today. So it's basically done by physical means, by chemical means, and by biologic means. Let's start with the biologic parts. Okay, so photosynthesis is something I'm sure you've studied in a previous class in biology and probably in middle school as well. And if you're like most of my students, you probably forgot about it, which really drives me nuts. Okay, so here's the deal: carbon dioxide, it's a very low energy molecule. It's present in the atmosphere everywhere on Earth. Water is present in soil, and obviously it's present at the surface of the earth too. Now these are both very low energy molecules. They you can't extract energy from them very well. But what happens is plants have this amazing ability to use chlorophyll to take energy from the sun, light energy, and break these molecules apart and rearrange them as this baby right here, which is called glucose. And I need you to know this equation here. CO2 plus H2O plus light energy turns into C6H12O6. Learn that one, C6H12O6. And it turns out there's some leftover oxygen just because when we balance the chemical equation, we needed a lot of carbon to make this. We needed six carbons, and we needed six waters, but we had leftover oxygen, so they come off. All right. But anyway, this is called photosynthesis. And basically, what it's essentially doing is plants are making their own food out of water and carbon dioxide and storing energy that they capture from the sun in this molecule right here. That is the high energy molecule that runs the entire biosphere. This is the molecule of life. I know DNA is too, but this is really the one that gives us the energy to live. Now, respiration is how this energy gets released. So photosynthesis captures the energy, but then photosynthesis releases that energy. Uh, did I just say photosynthesis twice? Respiration is what releases this energy. So all organisms, every living thing on the planet, every single cell on the planet undergoes respiration. Now, we're only going to talk about what's called aerobic respiration. No, but there are other forms. But and all organisms do it. But we're going to focus on what's called aerobic. So the thing is, it's not just something that you and I do. Plants do it. Mushrooms do it. Bacteria do it. Everything undergoes respiration or it dies. 100% of the time, every cell, every moment of the day has to be undergoing respiration. And here's how it works. You take that high energy molecule, C6H12O6, that's the glucose that was made by photosynthesis. Now you take some of that oxygen that the plants didn't need and you combine this together. So you're basically using oxygen to break this apart and you're turning it back into carbon dioxide and water. And then there's a lot of leftover energy, and that's the energy with which organisms live with. So if you notice, this equation is exactly the opposite of the photosynthesis equation. So really, you just need to learn the photosynthesis equation and just go, well, for respiration, I just got to flip it backwards. But this is basically where the energy to drive the biosphere comes from. Now, it's worth pointing out that as we go through this year, we're going to talk about one of the things that humans have done in the last 100 years is we started burning a lot of things like coal, oil, natural gas, forests, and the process of combustion of carbon compounds is basically identical to respiration, except for the starting molecule, right? So remember, respiration starts with C6H12O6. You're going to learn that one. Plus oxygen makes CO2 plus water and leftover energy. But look what's happening when you burn gasoline. All right, so gasoline is typically the octane molecule, C8H18. Notice it's a carbon hydrogen molecule, kind of like that one, right? And we combine it with oxygen. So what happens during the carburation of a car? And what comes out the exhaust pipe of a car? CO2 plus H2O, and the energy is used to make the car go. It's the exact same process. So once we learn combustion, it's easy to then relate it to a lot of other things that humans do. But notice, carbon dioxide is always one of the products. Now, things like animals and plants are constantly consuming glucose and breathing out, but keep in mind, so are things called decomposers, like things like bacteria and fungi and worms and little tiny bugs. Everything that is alive has to undergo respiration in order to stay alive. And so everything is essentially exhaling carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, including things like mushrooms and bacteria and worms. So let's just talk about the processes by which carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere and those by which it's put back into the atmosphere. Okay, so photosynthesis is taken out of photosynthesis. Carbon is taken out of the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. Plants take carbon dioxide, water, turn it into glucose inside the plant. Carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere when it diffuses into water, right, into seawater. Also, when shells are formed, we're going to see shells basically take that carbon dioxide that went into water and use it to build their shells and store it that way. So shells are basically a way of storing it. Right? Wood is a way of storing it. The things that are built out of carbon dioxide, then store it for a long time. Now, processes that release it back into the atmosphere would include, as we said, respiration, but also just as carbon dioxide can diffuse into the ocean, it can also diffuse out of it. Basically, what happens is this: if the water gets cold, then carbon dioxide goes in. When it gets warm, the molecules push hard, they push the carbon dioxide back out. Burning wood or fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, that releases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You've probably heard that. And so can volcanic activity. So with this in mind, now we can start constructing a carbon cycle. So what we find is basically carbon can go into the ocean or it can come out of the ocean. It can get captured by photosynthesis in plants, but if we burn those plants, it comes back out, and those plants and animals respire anyway, putting it back in the atmosphere. Volcanoes put it back in the atmosphere. But once it goes into the ocean, sometimes it gets caught up in shells and becomes sediments. Sometimes it becomes oil and natural gas, which can sit underground for a long time, but eventually they come back up. And it's worth noting, soils have quite a bit of carbon in them. There's a lot of decomposing matter that's present in soils. So let's talk a minute about coal, oil, and natural gas, because this is going to be an important part of this year. So coal and oil are based in natural gas are formed from plant matter that died but then didn't get consumed. It didn't rot and decompose. So bacteria and fungi did not eat it. Instead, its energy got trapped underground. And so basically, like when trees fall into water that's got low oxygen and high acidity, then bacteria aren't able to eat the wood. So the energy in the wood just stays there, and over time it gets buried and compressed, and it turns into coal, which we call fossil fuel. Oil forms in a very similar way, but instead of forming out of trees, it forms out of dead plankton in the ocean. But the same idea. They died, they fell into a place where they couldn't get consumed. There wasn't enough oxygen for respiration to occur, so it just got trapped in there. But the thing is, coal, oil, and natural gas, they contain essentially carbon compounds whose energy was extracted from sunlight through photosynthesis millions to hundreds of millions of years ago. So let's just look at coal in particular. Coal is formed from trees that fall into swamps. Uh, these swamps have water where the trees can't decompose. So over time, heat and pressure will turn those dead plants, which are mostly trees, into a layer of coal. So the energy that got extracted through photosynthesis 200 million years ago is still sitting down there as coal. Oil is very similar, except it's aquatic organisms. It's not really squids and sharks. I don't know what this is. Right? It's mostly plankton. But the same idea. They die, they get buried under mud where there's not enough oxygen to support bacterial decomposition and respiration. And so it gets turned into a layer of oil. Same idea, though, is photosynthesis in the ocean a long time ago, tens of millions of years ago, is that carbon is still trapped down there, still has its energy in it. CO2 moves into the oceans through diffusion and it comes out. Just think of it this way. Um, if you increase the temperature of a gas, you increase pressure. All right, think of carbon dioxide as a gas, okay? If water is cold, that means low pressure. The pressure is lower in the water than it is in the air, so it moves into the water. When the water gets warm, the pressure in the water is warmer than it is in the air, so it moves out of the air. So the ocean kind of breathes carbon dioxide. Now, the vast majority of the carbon dioxide on the planet is present in the world's oceans. And so basically what happens is that carbon dioxide comes into the ocean near the poles and then it gets breathed out when it gets close to the equator. Now, some of that water that goes in there gets turned into shell material. So here's what happens. When carbon dioxide goes into the ocean, it combines with water to form this. It's called carbonic acid, and it contains this ion here, CO3. Now, carbonic acid separates into H and CO3. And what happens is, things that make shells, clams, some plankton, snails, corals, what they do is they take that CO3 and they combine it with calcium ions to form CaCO3, calcium carbonate. That's what shells are made of. That's what coral is made out of. And so essentially they're storing, just the way that coal and oil did, they're storing carbon for a long time in their shell materials. Now what happens is a lot of these shells, they end up getting buried and they turn into a kind of rock material called limestone. So limestone, if you've ever been to Southeast Asia, makes these very dramatic karst shells. We have some in Korea. Basically, when you have caves, you have limestone. All right. Well, this limestone is basically just old shells. So that limestone represents a whole bunch of really old carbon that's no longer in the atmosphere. Instead, it's in the geosphere. So reservoirs of carbon would be places where it could be stored. It can be stored in the atmosphere. It can be stored in the ocean. It can be stored in forests. So a tree has a lot of carbon in it. Soils have lots of carbon in them because there's dead plant material in the soils. We already said coal, oil, natural gas, seawater, and limestone. So these are the places where we have what we call carbon sinks, reservoirs of carbon in the carbon cycle. Now, if we burn wood, essentially what we're doing is it's the same as respiration. We're taking a carbon compound plus oxygen, and we're going to turn to carbon dioxide and water. So that puts carbon dioxide back in the atmosphere. So if we burn wood, we burn fossil fuels, we're putting carbon dioxide back in the atmosphere. Another thing that puts it back in the atmosphere is volcanic actions, because what happens is limestone, when it gets pushed underground by tectonic forces, it melts. When it subducts, that limestone melts, and that carbon that was in the limestone, that was from the shells, it gets converted back into carbon dioxide and comes out the volcanoes, completing the cycle. So then we can talk about what's called the fast carbon cycle and the slow carbon cycle. The fast carbon cycle would be the part of the carbon cycle that happens within a lifetime of an organism. So the oldest organisms are trees. So we're saying this is cycles that take place within the framework of hours to 1,000 years. That would be the time frame of the fast carbon cycle. So basically, carbon dioxide comes into trees, animals eat the trees, they respire it back out. That's the fast carbon cycle. It basically, this tree might live to be 1,000 years old. So potentially carbon could spend 1,000 years cycling through the fast carbon cycle, but that's about it. Now, the long carbon cycle can last tens to hundreds of millions of years. And here's why: it involves tectonic movement. As we've learned from the past, it's very slow. So, what happens is carbonate compounds, those are the ones, those shells, they form limestone. We also have coal, oil, and natural gas that could be in these sediments. And so, the process of subduction slowly carries these sediments down into the mantle where they then melt and become part of the magma that then comes back out. So the limestone melts, the coal, the oil, the natural gas, they get converted back into carbon dioxide and come out, and that completes what we call the slow carbon cycle, which can take hundreds of millions of years to process. So basically, that's the carbon cycle, and we're just going to spend some time making sure we understand the different components of it and how long things are going to be there. Thanks for watching the screencast. Sorry it took so long.